by explaining, how might town government be affected by this?
Sure. Um, First of all, I'll just tell you I don't profess to be a expert on the subject of reauthorizing the debt, but I get a pretty good idea about how it all works. And the most serious impact it would have on local government, it would drive up our interest rates on municipal debt that we issue. Reason being, there's a same supply and demand relationship between borrowings and interest rates as there is with any commodity. So an interest rate represents the cost of money, basically. I want to borrow money from you. You decide what's the likelihood I'm going to pay you back, and the interest rate, which is the amount I pay you beyond the amount you give me, is really dependent upon how solid you think a risk I am. So if the American government, the federal government, defaults on Fed T-bills and Treasury bonds, then that says the country is not a good risk, obviously. Now that means that all units of government in America are going to be affected similarly. The buyers of our debt locally tend to be local buyers. So from a risk point of view, our interest costs don't go up because really we're a risk. They go up because the impact on the federal government is going to be to drive up the cost of their bonds because they'll now be seen as a bad risk. That'll push up their cost. And there's a general drag effect on local, state and local debt with federal. So if federal goes up, state and local is going to go up too. By how much is anybody's guess? We don't really know, but that's going to be the key thing. Other things are possible. When the federal government rather, has to put a lot more of its operating assets, principally tax revenue, into paying the debt because their interest costs will go up. So more of what the federal government brings in will have to go to pay debt. There'll be less money available for social programs, the military, all the money that the federal government spends. Well, a lot of what the federal government spends, they spend on us. They give to us in forms of grants and all sorts of programs. Well, some of that will dry up, or it'll be reduced. So there'll be a very serious effect. Now, a small suburban community like Foxborough, majority of that money goes to the school department and federal programs, school lunch programs, after school programs, things like that. The town government doesn't get that much, but we get some stuff. Some of our transportation improvement money comes from the feds, and that'll get less, there'll be less of that. So there could be all sorts of effects. Those are the ones we know of. There could be a lot of other hidden effects on us that we haven't even begun to think about yet, too.
Right. Right. Now, so, say for the average Foxborough resident, I mean, they start to see all these trickle-down effects coming from the federal government. Could you give a scenario where the average resident might be affected? Could they see bigger class sizes? Could they see less police officers on the street?
Well, it's tough to say because translating higher interest costs on a town project into an impact on the taxpayers is difficult to say because right now the only big capital project we've got going on is this building. There'll be a proposal going to the voters to either rehab this building or tear it down and build a new one. And that's going to be somewhere between a $5 and $8 million cost. And the interest rate that we get when we borrow that money, because some of it will be borrowed, can be higher or lower depending upon what happens to the national debt. We're not intending to ask the voters for an override to do that. We're intending to absorb it in the budget. But to the extent we have to pay more for interest versus less, that can have an impact in other areas of the budget, which could be education, police, fire, whatever. But trying to quantify that at this point, pretty impossible, because there's so many moving parts before I could begin to try to quantify that. And those are all affected by events that haven't happened yet. So really couldn't give you a specific on that except to say that there would be an effect.
Right. Would you say that an override, if you were able to borrow less money, if you got less state aid, would you say an override might be a possibility?
Well, no, I don't think an override is going to happen in this town. We've never done an override, an operating budget override. We do debt exclusion overrides for capital projects. So Would it be more likely that we do a debt exclusion override? Well, I don't think you're gonna see the selectmen or I propose one, because we know the times are tough and we know people aren't gonna approve it. I wouldn't vote for one right now, so we're not even gonna go there. What it really means is that the project that we would have done with it won't get done. So this project, this town hall project, won't get done. It'll get delayed. Now, given the fact that we've got some pretty serious issues here in terms of overcrowding, asbestos in the pipes, asbestos in the floor tiles, asbestos in the ceiling, lead in the attic from when it used to be a police department, and the gun range deflector sent the lead powder into the attic, mold and mildew in the basement. Those are all pretty serious problems that we need to address. So if that ends up getting delayed for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, right now, there's no public health risk. But at any given moment, conditions can change, and this building could be very quickly rendered to a condition where we'd have to leave it. And that would mean we'd have to house the whole staff somewhere else, and we'd have to pay a cost for that. So there's a lot of potential bad effects with this national debt thing that are hard to predict. But delaying big projects is a bad thing. They don't get cheaper. You know, building projects get more expensive. They don't get less expensive. So it'll end up costing more.
Do you guys use bonding? I know in Easton they have their capital budget. A lot of it is through bonding, and it's a lot of road repairs, things like that. Do you guys have a lot of projects like that in addition to this building?
Most of our capital stuff is what we call pay-as-you-go. We are one of very few communities that carve part of our revenue off every year for capital spending, and we don't let it flow into the operating budget. And that revenue is pretty cyclical. It recurs every year, so we don't do a lot of borrowing for our capital budget, so it wouldn't be affected. What would be affected is big projects that you couldn't possibly do with your annual capital budget, like this. You know, $7, $8, $9, $10 million projects. You got to borrow for those, and those would be affected.
Do you think America defaulting might have an effect on your business community in Foxborough?
Well, everybody will pay higher interest. Everybody will get less from the feds, and there's a whole variety of programs that that could impact. Long term, if the world decides that it's not going to buy our bonds, or worse, it decides to sell the bonds it already holds. I think I heard a report, something like 70% of the American bonds are owned by foreign entities. That could precipitate. I mean, if they decided to not buy our bonds, or they decided to sell what they already own, that could precipitate a full-on, return to the recession where we were 2 years ago, or an out-and-out depression. So, yeah, that would have an effect on business in an epic way, not to mention all of us.
Right.
And that, of course, is the big fear. That's what everybody's afraid of. We repudiate payment on our bonds. People start dumping the bonds that hold them nationally or calling them in, and we're in big trouble.
Right. All right. That's all I had for you. Appreciate it.